Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I never imagined that my 33rd year would bring me face to face with something that would shake my understanding of what lurks in the quiet places of this world. My name doesn't matter now. What matters is what happened during those 48 hours in October when the Swedish wilderness showed me its true face. Living in Småland, in a town so small it barely registers on most maps, you learn to appreciate the vast stretches of untouched forest that surround you. The silence here isn't just quiet, it's absolute, broken only by the wind through ancient pines and the distant call of loons across hidden lakes. I've always found solace in these wild places, especially after my divorce 2 years ago left me searching for something I couldn't name. The back problems that had plagued me through the summer were finally manageable by mid-October. Months of physiotherapy and careful stretching had given me enough mobility to consider my annual camping trip to Djupsjön, the deep lake, a remote body of water nestled in a chain of connected waterways about 3 hours' hike from the nearest road. The locals in my town speak of it in hushed tones, not because of any superstition, but because of its raw, untamed beauty and the way sound carries across its surface in the dead of night. My friend Astrid agreed to join me, though I could tell she had reservations. She's always been more comfortable with her creature comforts than I am, but she understood my need to reclaim this ritual that had become so important to my mental health. We packed carefully. October camping in Sweden demands respect for the elements. Our gear included heavy sleeping bags rated for sub-zero temperatures, waterproof everything, and enough food for 4 days in case weather trapped us longer than planned. The hike in took us along increasingly narrow trails, marked only by faded blazes on tree trunks and occasional cairns left by previous hikers. The forest grew denser as we climbed, the canopy blocking out more and more daylight until we were walking through a green-tinted twilight, even at midday. The sound of our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, our breathing visible in small puffs despite the mild temperature. When we finally emerged at the lake's edge around 4 in the afternoon, I was struck by how different it looked from my memories. The water level seemed lower than usual, exposing more of the rocky shoreline and revealing the skeletal remains of drowned trees that normally stayed hidden beneath the surface. These pale, twisted branches reached up from the depths like gnarled fingers, creating an almost cemetery-like atmosphere around the lake's perimeter. Several other groups had already established camp, more than I'd ever seen here before. A young couple with kayaks had claimed the best spot on the eastern shore, while a family with 2 children, maybe 8 and 10 years old, had set up an elaborate campsite complete with a screened dining fly. Their laughter echoed across the water as they played on the narrow beach, the sound both comforting and somehow unsettling in its intensity. We found a decent spot about 50 meters from the water's edge, close enough to enjoy the view but far enough back to avoid the moisture that would rise from the lake as temperatures dropped overnight. As we set up our tent, I noticed how the other campers kept glancing toward the water nervously, their conversations dropping to whispers whenever the wind died down completely. The process of making camp took on an almost ritualistic quality as the afternoon wore on. Every stake driven into the ground, every guy line adjusted, felt like we were marking our territory in a place that didn't quite welcome human presence. The old wind shelter Astrid and I decided to use for our evening fire sat about 30 meters from our tent, its corrugated metal roof partially collapsed on one side and graffitied with initials and dates going back decades. Someone had carved, "God Protect Us All, 1987, into one of the support beams, the letters deep and precise, as if made with desperate intention rather than casual vandalism. I ran my fingers over the words, feeling the rough edges of the cuts, and wondered what had prompted such an urgent plea in this seemingly peaceful place. The fireplace itself was in better condition than the shelter, built from local stones and blackened by countless previous fires. Someone had left a decent supply of split birch and pine, though the wood felt unusually damp for October. It took several attempts and half a tube of fire-starting paste to get flames going, and even then, the fire seemed reluctant to catch properly, producing more smoke than heat in those first crucial minutes. As evening approached, the temperature began dropping more rapidly than I'd expected. My weather app showed clear skies and mild temperatures, but the air felt thick and oppressive, like it does before a severe thunderstorm. The other campers seemed to sense it too. Conversations became more subdued, and I noticed the family with children kept glancing up at the sky as if expecting clouds that weren't there. Dinner was a simple affair of instant pasta and canned sauce, but even the familiar ritual of cooking over an open flame felt different somehow. The flames danced in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, casting shadows that moved independently of their source. Astrid commented on it first, pausing mid-sentence to stare at the fire with a puzzled expression. "Have you ever seen flames move like that?" she asked, pointing to where the fire seemed to be reaching toward the lake, bending at impossible angles despite the complete absence of wind. I had noticed it too, but hearing her voice, my unease made it suddenly more real, more threatening. The fire was behaving like it was being drawn toward something, pulled by an invisible force that had nothing to do with air currents or fuel distribution. When I tried to photograph the phenomenon, my phone camera refused to focus properly, producing only blurred images that showed nothing unusual. The children from the family campsite had grown quieter as darkness fell, staying close to their parents instead of exploring the shoreline as they had earlier. I caught their father scanning the tree line repeatedly, his hand resting on what looked like a large hunting knife on his belt. When our eyes met across the distance between our camps, he offered a tense smile and a nod, but didn't approach for the usual camping small talk about weather and trail conditions. By 9 o'clock, full darkness had settled over the lake like a heavy blanket. The water, which had been mirror-smooth during the day, now moved with small, regular swells that seemed to originate from no particular source. These waves lapped against the shore with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, but just irregular enough to keep you from getting comfortable with the sound. Astrid and I had retreated to the warmth of our sleeping bags by 10:30, though neither of us felt particularly tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from fresh air and physical activity seemed absent, replaced by a restless energy that made relaxation impossible. We lay in our respective sleeping bags, making quiet conversation about everything except the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. The sounds of the lake at night were unlike anything I remembered from previous visits. Instead of the gentle lapping of small waves, the water moved with purpose, creating sounds that resembled footsteps, deliberate, measured, circling. When I mentioned this to Astrid, she admitted she'd been listening to the same thing for the past hour, trying to convince herself it was just the wind or settling ice, though the temperature hadn't dropped below freezing. Around midnight, Astrid's breathing settled into the deep rhythm of sleep, but rest continued to evade me. My back ached despite the comfortable sleeping pad, and every small sound from outside seemed amplified to an unbearable degree. The zipper on our tent fly rattled with each breath of wind, creating a metallic chattering that sounded almost like Morse code. That's when I first became aware of the watching. It started as a feeling, the familiar sensation of being observed that makes the hair on your neck stand up. But this was more intense than anything I'd experienced before. A presence so focused and deliberate that it felt almost physical, like a weight pressing down on the tent from above. I found myself holding my breath, listening for any sound that might explain the sensation, but the night had gone completely quiet. Even the water had stopped its rhythmic movement against the shore. I reached for my phone to check the time, squinting at the bright screen in the darkness. 2:47 a.m. The battery showed full charge, but the signal bars were completely absent. Not unusual this far into the wilderness, but my phone had shown at least one bar when we'd arrived. Now it displayed no service with the finality of a door slamming shut. The first sound came from directly above us. It started as a soft scratching against the tent's rainfly, like branches brushing against the fabric in the wind. But the scratching was too regular, too purposeful to be random contact with vegetation. It moved in deliberate patterns across the roof of our tent, pausing at the corners as if testing the structural integrity of our shelter. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as the scratching continued its circuit around our tent. 3 times it made the complete loop: roof, down the side, across the bottom edge, up the other side, back to the roof. Each circuit took exactly the same amount of time, as if whatever was making the sound was following a predetermined route with mechanical precision. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the sound had been. At least while I could hear the scratching, I knew where the threat was located. Now whatever had been testing our defenses could be anywhere, circling back for another approach, moving to a different position, or simply waiting for us to let our guard down. I reached over carefully to wake Astrid, but she was already awake, her eyes wide and reflecting what little light filtered through the tent walls. She held up a finger to her lips, then pointed toward the tent's entrance. Through the thin fabric, we could see the shadow of something large moving past, blocking out what little starlight made it through the forest canopy. The shadow paused directly in front of our tent. What stood outside our tent defied easy description. Through the translucent fabric, we could see its outline, roughly human in proportions, but wrong in every detail that mattered. Too tall, too broad at the shoulders, with limbs that seemed to bend at joints that shouldn't exist. It remained motionless for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, as if studying our reactions to its presence. I found myself analyzing every detail I could make out, trying to find rational explanations that refused to come. The shape was definitely bipedal, but its posture was all wrong, leaning forward in a way that suggested a different center of gravity than any human would have. When it moved, it did so with a fluid motion that reminded me of water flowing uphill, natural in its own way, but fundamentally disturbing to observe. Astrid had pressed herself against the far side of the tent, as far from the entrance as possible, her sleeping bag pulled up to her chin. I could hear her trying to control her breathing, taking slow, deliberate breaths through her nose to avoid making any sound that might draw the thing's attention. Her face was pale in the dim light, eyes fixed on the shadow that continued its patient vigil just outside our door. The temperature inside the tent began dropping noticeably, despite our body heat and the insulation of our sleeping bags. Our breath became visible, small puffs of vapor that dissipated quickly in the increasingly frigid air. This wasn't the gradual cooling you'd expect from a clear night. It was as if something was actively drawing heat from our immediate environment. I reached for the small knife I kept clipped to the inside of the tent, more for comfort than any realistic hope it would be useful against whatever was out there. The metal was so cold it almost burned my fingers, and I realized that the temperature drop was severe enough to affect our gear. Our water bottles, which had been room temperature when we went to bed, now showed a skin of ice around their contents. The shadow began moving again, but this time its motion was different, more exploratory, almost curious. It reached toward the tent with what might have been an arm, pressing against the fabric from outside. The tent wall bent inward under the pressure, forming an impression that looked almost like a handprint, but with too many fingers, each one too long and jointed in the wrong places. The pressure increased gradually, stretching the fabric to its limits. I could hear the synthetic material beginning to stress, making tiny popping sounds as individual threads reached their breaking point. If this continued, our tent, our only barrier between us and whatever was out there, would tear open, leaving us exposed and defenseless. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure stopped. The shadow withdrew, and we heard footsteps moving away from our campsite, but not the footsteps of any creature I could identify. They were too heavy, landing with the solid impact of something much larger than a human, but spaced too far apart for any animal I knew. Each step seemed to sink deep into the ground, as if the thing walking was far heavier than its size would suggest. We tracked its movement by sound as it circled our camp in a wide arc, staying just at the edge of visibility in the forest. The footsteps had a wet quality to them, like boots squelching through mud, though the ground around our campsite had been relatively dry. Occasionally we heard the sound of branches breaking under its weight, though the forest here wasn't particularly dense. The circuit it made around our position took nearly 10 minutes, a leisurely pace that suggested it wasn't in any hurry to leave. When it completed the circle, returning to approximately where it had started, the footsteps stopped entirely. Once again, we were left in complete silence, not knowing where the threat had gone or whether it was still nearby. What happened next challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The silence that had fallen over our campsite was broken by a sound from the lake. Not the gentle lapping of waves, but something that resembled human speech, though distorted beyond easy recognition. Voices seemed to rise from the water itself, multiple conversations overlapping in languages that might have been Swedish or might have been something else entirely. The words were just clear enough to be maddening. I found myself straining to understand, catching fragments that sounded like names, like pleas, like warnings given too late to matter. Astrid grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in so hard I knew there would be bruises the next day. She was hearing it too, this impossible conversation between the living water and something that answered from beneath its surface. "Do you understand what they're saying?" she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the complete silence of our tent. I shook my head, though I wasn't entirely truthful. Some of the words were becoming clearer as my ears adjusted to the strange acoustics. I heard "go into Närmare," "don't come closer," repeated several times in what sounded like a child's voice. Other phrases were less distinct but carried an unmistakable tone of urgency, of warning. The voices seemed to be coming from different depths in the lake, some sounding like they were just below the surface, while others echoed up from much deeper water. This created a layered effect, like a choir singing in rounds, but the harmonies were all wrong, creating dissonances that made my teeth ache and my vision blur around the edges. As we listened, the conversations began to organize themselves into something approaching coherence. It became clear that some voices were asking questions while others provided answers, though the answers were rarely reassuring. The deeper voices, the ones that seemed to come from the very bottom of the lake, spoke with an authority that the surface voices lacked, giving instructions or pronouncements that were received with what sounded like fear or resignation. I realized that I was beginning to understand more of what was being said, as if exposure to the sounds was teaching me their meaning through some process that bypassed normal language acquisition. This understanding brought with it a growing sense of horror as the content of the conversations became clear. They were discussing us. The surface voices, the ones that sounded most human, were reporting on our presence, describing our campsite, our gear, our apparent level of preparation or vulnerability. The deeper voices asked questions about our behavior, our defenses, our likely responses to different approaches. It was like listening to predators plan an attack, comparing notes on the best strategies for dealing with their prey. But there was something else in the conversation that was even more disturbing. References to previous visitors, other campers who had come to this lake over the years. The voices spoke of them with the casual familiarity of creatures discussing a regular food source, comparing the relative merits of different groups, different individuals, different methods of approach. One surface voice, speaking in what I now clearly recognized as Swedish, mentioned the family with children currently camped on the eastern shore. The description was detailed and clinical, noting the parents' vigilance, the children's movements during the day, the layout of their campsite. The deep voice that responded gave what sounded like approval, followed by instructions that I couldn't quite make out but that filled me with a cold dread. The voices were planning something for tonight, and it involved all of us. At 3:47 a.m., exactly 1 hour after the voices from the lake had fallen silent, we heard the first scream. It came from the direction of the family's campsite, high-pitched and filled with terror. The scream of a child who has seen something that their young mind cannot process or accept. The sound cut through the night air like a blade, sharp and clean and absolutely horrible in its intensity. It was followed immediately by a second scream, different in pitch, but equally terrified, as the other child joined the first. Astrid and I were out of our sleeping bags and moving toward the tent entrance before we'd consciously decided to act. Every instinct told us to stay hidden, to avoid drawing attention to ourselves, but the sound of children in mortal terror overrode our self-preservation. I grabbed the large flashlight from my pack while Astrid found her hiking boots, and we prepared to leave the relative safety of our tent. The screaming continued, but it was moving. Not staying in one place as you'd expect if the children were in their tent or campsite, but traveling in a path that seemed to lead toward the water. Mixed with the children's voices, we could hear their parents shouting, calling their names, their voices raw with panic and desperation. I unzipped the tent fly and stepped into the night, my flashlight beam cutting through darkness so complete it seemed solid. The beam only extended about 20 meters before being swallowed by the black air, creating a small bubble of visibility that moved with us as we hurried toward the eastern shore. The ground between our campsite and the family's location was rougher than I remembered from the daylight crossing, filled with roots and holes that seemed designed to trip us up. More than once I had to grab Astrid's arm to keep her from falling, and twice she did the same for me as we navigated terrain that seemed to shift and change under our feet. As we got closer to the other campsite, the screaming began to fade. Not because it was ending, but because it was moving away from us, toward the lake. The parents' voices were closer now, and I could make out individual words in their panicked calls. They were Swedish, from Stockholm based on their accent, and they were calling for Maya and Eric, the children whose screams were now coming from somewhere near the water's edge. When we reached their campsite, we found chaos. Their tent had been torn open from the outside, the fabric shredded as if by massive claws. Camping gear was scattered in all directions, and their carefully organized camp kitchen had been completely destroyed. The parents, a woman in her 30s and a man about my age, were standing at the edge of the light from our flashlight, calling desperately into the darkness. "Our children," the woman said when she saw us, switching to accented English. "Something took our children. We heard them screaming, and when we got out of the tent, they were gone. The screaming is coming from the lake, but we can't see anything." The man was already moving toward the water, following the sound of voices that were growing fainter with each passing moment. "Maya! Eric! Where are you?" he called, his voice cracking with emotion. I aimed my flashlight toward the lake, but the beam seemed weaker here, as if the darkness around the water was particularly resistant to illumination. We could still hear the children, but their voices were different now. Less panicked, more confused, as if they were no longer certain of their own situation. That's when we saw the shapes in the water. The lake, which had been mirror smooth when we arrived, was now churning with movement. Dark shapes broke the surface at irregular intervals, too large and too numerous to be fish, too purposeful in their movements to be debris stirred up by wind. In the weak beam of my flashlight, I could make out what looked like heads, or at least rounded protrusions that turned toward our light as if aware of our presence. The children's voices were definitely coming from the water now, but they sounded wrong, too calm, too accepting of their situation. Instead of the panicked screaming we'd heard earlier, Maya and Eric were now speaking in conversational tones, as if they were discussing something mildly interesting, rather than finding themselves somehow transported to the middle of a dark lake in the middle of the night. "They're talking to something," Astrid whispered, her hand gripping my arm so tightly I could feel her fingernails through my jacket. "Listen, they're answering questions." She was right. The children's voices had taken on the rhythm of a dialogue, pausing as if listening to responses we couldn't hear, then answering in the polite, careful tones children use when talking to adult strangers. But there was something else in their voices now, a dreamy quality, as if they were speaking from within a trance or under some form of influence. The parents had heard it too. The father was already wading into the lake, ignoring the shocking cold of the water as he pushed deeper, following the sound of his children's voices. "Maya, Eric, swim to me. Can you hear me?" he called. But his children didn't seem to register his presence at all. The mother grabbed my flashlight, aiming it toward where her husband was now waist-deep in the dark water. In the beam, we could see more of the shapes surrounding him, sleek, dark forms that moved with intelligence and purpose. They weren't approaching him directly, but they were definitely watching him, circling at a distance that seemed calculated to prevent escape while avoiding direct confrontation. "There are so many of them," the mother breathed, her voice filled with a mixture of terror and awe. "What are they? What do they want with our children?" I couldn't answer because I was beginning to understand something that I desperately didn't want to acknowledge. The shapes in the water weren't random creatures that had wandered into the lake. They belonged here. This was their territory, their hunting ground, and we were all intruders who had stumbled into something far older and more dangerous than any of us had imagined. The father had reached the point where the lake bottom dropped away sharply, and he was now swimming toward where the children's voices seemed strongest. But as he moved deeper into the lake, the voices began moving away from him, staying just out of reach. It was clear that whatever had the children was leading him deeper, drawing him away from shore and safety. That's when the other sounds started. From all around the lake's perimeter came new voices, not the children this time, but adults speaking in low, urgent tones. These voices were coming from the forest, from the shoreline, from positions that encircled our entire group. As I listened, I realized that some of these voices sounded familiar, speaking with accents and inflections that reminded me of people I knew from my hometown. But that was impossible. We were hours away from any settlement, days away from anyone who might know us personally. Yet the voices continued, calling out names I recognized, using phrases and references that were specific to my life, my relationships, my personal history. One voice, coming from the forest behind our original campsite, was calling my name in a tone that sounded exactly like my ex-husband, the man I divorced 2 years ago and hadn't spoken to since. He was calling me to come to him, telling me he'd been looking for me, that he had something important to say. The voice was perfect, down to the slight lisp he had when he was emotional, but I knew it couldn't be him. It couldn't be any of them. Dawn came slowly to the lake, creeping across the water like oil spreading over glass. By the time the first pale light began filtering through the forest canopy, the voices had fallen silent. The shapes in the water had disappeared, and the lake had returned to its deceptive tranquility. But the damage had been done, and nothing would ever be the same for any of us who survived that night. The father had been found floating face down near the center of the lake, his body showing no signs of violence or struggle. He appeared to have simply stopped swimming, stopped fighting, and allowed himself to sink beneath the surface. When the authorities arrived later that morning, summoned by an emergency beacon one of the other campers had activated, they would list the cause of death as accidental drowning, possibly due to hypothermia and disorientation. Maya and Eric were never found. The official search lasted 5 days, involving divers, sonar equipment, and teams of volunteers who combed every inch of the lake and surrounding forest. They found no trace of the children, no bodies, no clothing, no evidence that they had ever been at the lake at all. The only proof of their existence was their mother's testimony and the family photos on her phone, images that seemed to grow fainter each time she looked at them. The other campers corroborated parts of our story: the torn tent, the parents' obvious distress, the father's desperate swim into the dark water. But none of them remembered hearing the children's screams, none of them had seen the shapes moving in the lake, and none of them could explain why their own sleep had been so deep and undisturbed while chaos erupted around them. Astrid and I gave our statements to the police, describing what we had witnessed as accurately as we could. But even as we spoke, I could see the skepticism in the officers' eyes, the way they exchanged glances when they thought we weren't looking. Our story sounded like the result of stress, sleep deprivation, and the kind of group hysteria that sometimes affects people in isolated situations. The mother left with the search and rescue team on the third day, her face hollow with grief and shock. She looked at Astrid and me before getting into the helicopter, her eyes holding questions she couldn't voice and accusations she couldn't prove. We had been there when her children vanished, we had witnessed their disappearance, and yet we had done nothing to save them. The lake was closed to camping indefinitely, though no official reason was given. A small sign was posted at the trailhead, citing environmental concerns and ongoing research, but those of us who had been there knew the real reason. Something lived in those dark waters, something that had claimed the lake as its own territory and would not tolerate intruders. I returned home to my small town, to my quiet life, to the familiar routines that had once brought me comfort. But sleep became my enemy, filled with dreams of dark water and voices calling from impossible depths. During the day, I found myself avoiding any body of water larger than a bathtub, crossing bridges with my eyes fixed straight ahead, unable to look down at the rivers flowing beneath. Astrid moved to Stockholm a month later, citing job opportunities and the need for a change of scenery. We spoke once after she left, a brief, awkward conversation that ended with both of us acknowledging that our friendship had become another casualty of that night by the lake. Some experiences are too intense to survive, too terrible to be shared without destroying the people who shared them. The official investigation was closed after 6 months, the case filed under accidental death with missing persons presumed drowned. The lake was eventually reopened to hikers and campers, though it never regained its former popularity. Those who did venture there reported unusually poor fishing, electronic equipment that malfunctioned for no apparent reason, and a general feeling of unease that made extended stays unpleasant. I never returned to Djupsjön, though I drive past the trailhead several times a year on my way to other hiking destinations. Each time I slow down and look toward the forest path that leads to the lake, wondering if the families who occasionally walk that trail with their children and camping gear have any idea what they might encounter in those dark waters. Sometimes on particularly quiet nights when the wind is still, and my small town seems wrapped in unnatural silence, I can still hear them. The voices from the lake, calling across impossible distances to remind me that some places in this world belong to things that are older, stranger, and far more dangerous than we like to believe. The children are still out there, somewhere beneath the surface of that black water, and they're no longer alone. God help anyone who goes looking for them. I woke up sweating in the early hours of January 12, 2024, my heart racing like I'd just sprinted a mile. At 32 years old, I should have outgrown night terrors, but something had changed in the past weeks. Sitting up in bed, I tried to regulate my breathing while images of my recently deceased ferret, Winston, flooded my thoughts. Winston hadn't been an ordinary pet. In his final months, he'd grown to an unusual size, nearly as large as a small cat. The veterinarian had been baffled, suggesting some kind of growth disorder. But it wasn't just his size that troubled me. It was his behavior. Winston had developed this unsettling habit of standing on his hind legs for extended periods, perfectly still, eyes fixed on me with an intensity no animal should possess. His typical playful chirps had transformed into low, guttural croaks that sometimes sounded almost melodic, as if he were attempting communication beyond his species' capabilities. The morning of his death, I found him in the center of my living room, upright and motionless. When I approached, he didn't acknowledge me. 3 hours later, he was dead. My mother had insisted I examine Winston's body, claiming there was something you need to see. Her tone had been urgent, frightened even. I'd refused, attributing her behavior to grief. Winston had been with us for 7 years, after all. Now, sitting in my darkened bedroom, I wondered what she'd seen. The thought made my stomach tighten. Outside, the wind pushed against my window, creating a steady, rhythmic tapping that sounded disturbingly deliberate. I switched on my bedside lamp, desperate to dispel the darkness. The shadows retreated, but my unease remained. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m. Too early to call Mom, too late to hope for restful sleep. I reached for my journal and began documenting the recurring nightmare that had jolted me awake. Winston standing before me, grown to impossible proportions, opening his mouth to reveal rows of teeth no ferret should possess. Despite the warm air pumping through my apartment's heating vents, I couldn't shake the pervasive coldness that seemed to originate from within my own body. 5 days after Winston's death, I called my friend Jamie, desperate for distraction. We agreed to meet at River Point Park, a sprawling green space at the edge of town where hiking trails wound through dense clusters of oak and pine. "You look terrible," Jamie said when we met at the trailhead. His bluntness was refreshing. "Haven't been sleeping well," I admitted, not wanting to delve into the nightmares. We set off down the main trail, our conversation gradually shifting to lighter topics: Jamie's new job, an upcoming concert we'd been planning to attend. For brief intervals, I forgot about Winston and the unnatural coldness that had taken residence in my apartment. About 2 miles into our hike, we encountered the deer. It stood approximately 20 yards ahead, a mature doe with a sleek brown coat. Unlike most deer I'd encountered while hiking, this one didn't bolt at our approach. It remained perfectly still, watching us with dark, reflective eyes. "That's weird," Jamie whispered. "Should be running by now." Instead of retreating, the deer took a tentative step toward us. "Maybe it's used to humans," I suggested, though something about its gaze made me doubt my own explanation. Jamie, always more adventurous than me, began making soft clicking sounds, extending his hand as if offering food. To our amazement, the deer responded, approaching with cautious steps until it stood mere feet away. "This is insane," Jamie whispered, pulling out his phone. "We've got to document this." He positioned himself beside me, angling his phone for a selfie with the deer in the background. The flash activated automatically, a brief, harsh burst of light. In that flash, I saw the deer's eyes reflect unnaturally, not the typical eyeshine of animals, but something deeper, almost phosphorescent. The photo, when Jamie showed it to me, was even more disturbing. The deer was staring directly at the camera, but its eyes appeared hollow, like black pits that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. "That's odd," Jamie said, zooming in on the image. We continued our hike, but something had shifted. The woods seemed quieter, the shadows between trees deeper. When we turned back toward the trailhead, I felt an unmistakable sensation of being observed. About 15 minutes after our deer encounter, Jamie grabbed my arm. "Look," he hissed, pointing ahead. "Is that the same one?" In the distance, partially obscured by underbrush, was what appeared to be the same doe. Only something was wrong with its posture. It was upright, balanced precariously on its hind legs, its front legs, no, arms, hanging awkwardly at its sides. "What the actual—" Jamie began. The deer, if that's what it truly was, began moving toward us with a jerky, uncoordinated gait, still maintaining its bipedal stance. The movement was so unnatural, so fundamentally wrong, that we both burst into nervous laughter. "It can't be real," I said, my voice higher than normal. The deer dropped back to all fours and bounded into the forest, disappearing among the trees. We stood frozen, our laughter dying in our throats. "Did you get that on video?" I asked. Jamie shook his head. No one would believe us anyway. That night, alone in my apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about the deer and its impossible movement. I recalled Winston's habit of standing upright, staring at me with that unsettling intensity. The parallel was too specific to dismiss as coincidence. Something was connecting these events, some pattern I couldn't yet discern. As I tried to sleep, I heard a faint scratching at my bedroom door. 3 slow, deliberate scrapes, followed by silence. When I gathered the courage to investigate, the hallway was empty, but the scratches remained. 3 distinct marks gouged into the wood. By mid-February, the incidents had escalated. I began finding small dead animals on my doorstep. First a sparrow, then a squirrel, each positioned with unnatural precision, their heads twisted completely backward. My sleep deteriorated further, punctuated by vivid nightmares and the persistent sensation of being observed even in my most private moments. I needed distance, perspective. I booked a room at the Pineview Hotel, a modest establishment about 40 miles outside town. The drive provided temporary relief, the familiar landmarks of my daily life receding in the rearview mirror. The hotel itself was underwhelming. A gray 2-story building with a flickering neon sign advertising an attached pub. What struck me as odd was the layout. The hallways to the guest rooms weren't fully enclosed, but partially open to the elements, with one side exposed to a small courtyard. Several stray cats prowled the perimeter as I checked in, their yowls echoing against the building's concrete facade. The desk clerk, a thin man with perpetually moist eyes, handed me a key card without making eye contact. "Pub closes at midnight," he said flatly. "Breakfast starts at 6. My room was on the 2nd floor, sparsely furnished but clean. I dropped my overnight bag on the bed and immediately headed for the pub, hoping alcohol might dull the constant edge of anxiety I'd been living with. The pub was moderately busy, populated by a mix of hotel guests and locals. A small stage in the corner hosted an amateur musician struggling through an acoustic cover of a song I vaguely recognized. I claimed a corner table and ordered a whiskey, then another, letting the ambient noise wash over me. For a few hours it worked. The tension in my shoulders eased. The persistent fear that had become my companion receded to a manageable distance. By closing time, I'd achieved a pleasant numbness that made the walk back to my room seem less daunting. The hallway was dimly lit, the exposed side allowing a cool breeze to infiltrate the space. As I rounded the corner toward my room, I heard an unusual sound, a shuffling, dragging noise accompanied by labored breathing. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing against the concrete walls. The shuffling stopped momentarily, then resumed with greater intensity. I moved forward cautiously and saw a woman standing with her back to me. She was heavy-set, dressed in a floral house dress that seemed inappropriate for the cool night air. Her gray hair hung in limp strands down her back. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I approached slowly, concerned she might be disoriented or ill. "Need a waiter," she slurred, her voice thick and wet. "Need service." "The pub's closed," I explained, still approaching. "But I can help you back to your room if—" She turned her head, only her head, rotating a full 180 degrees, while her body remained facing away from me. The sound was sickening, a wet cracking noise like celery being snapped underwater. Her face, now looking directly at me despite her body's orientation, wore an expression of blank curiosity. Her eyes, milky and unfocused, fixed on mine. My muscles locked in terror. The woman's mouth opened, revealing blackened gums and a tongue that seemed too long, too mobile. A raspy moan escaped her lips. Then she began to move, her feet dragging across the floor as if pulled by invisible strings. She didn't walk so much as glide, leaving dark, wet marks on the linoleum. The overhead lights flickered erratically, casting her distorted form in alternating light and shadow. I pressed myself against the wall, unable to move or scream. She drifted past me, close enough that I could smell the sour, musty odor emanating from her. Not decay exactly, but something equally repulsive. like old meat left too long in a warm refrigerator. Once she disappeared around the corner, I broke from my paralysis and ran to my room, fumbling with the key card 3 times before the lock disengaged. Inside, I secured every possible latch and wedged a chair under the doorknob for good measure. Throughout the night, I heard scratching at my door. Not the casual pawing of a curious cat, but deliberate, rhythmic scraping that seemed designed to maximize my terror. Occasionally, the scratching was interrupted by low moans that sounded less human with each repetition. By dawn, I was sitting cross-legged on the bed, staring unblinking at the door, convinced that whatever waited outside wasn't just the woman with the twisted neck, but something far worse. Something that had been following me since Winston's death. Something that could inhabit different forms. As soon as morning light filtered through the thin curtains, I packed my bag and prepared to leave. When I opened my door, the hallway was empty, but 3 distinct scratch marks marred the wood near the handle, identical to those I'd found on my bedroom door at home. Back in my apartment, I began documenting everything. I filled a notebook with detailed accounts of each incident, starting with Winston's strange behavior and death, through the deer encounter, to the hotel experience. When I reviewed my notes, certain patterns emerged. 1. Each encounter involved an unnatural physical distortion. Winston's growth, the deer's bipedal stance, the woman's rotated head. 2. In each case, the entity seemed aware of me specifically, maintaining eye contact or directing its attention toward me. 3. The scratches, always in sets of 3, appeared after each major incident. I taped sheets of paper across my living room wall, creating a timeline. Red string connected related events. Photographs of Winston before his death. The deer, courtesy of Jamie's phone. The scratch marks provided visual evidence. Standing back, I saw what resembled a detective's murder board, except I couldn't identify the crime or the perpetrator. At the end of February, I received a call from my mother. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "About Winston." We met at her house the following day. She seemed to have aged years in the weeks since I'd seen her last. New lines etched into her face, her movements more hesitant. "I should have told you this sooner," she began, hands clutching a mug of tea so tightly her knuckles whitened. "When Winston died, when I found him, something was wrong." "Wrong how?" I prompted when she fell silent. "His body," she whispered. "It wasn't right. Inside, I mean." She explained that she'd wrapped Winston's body in a towel, intending to bury him in the backyard. But the towel had come loose, revealing his abdomen split open, not from decay or predation, but as if something had emerged from within him. "There were these sacs," she continued, her voice dropping further. "Like egg casings, but empty. Dozens of them, and his internal organs weren't where they should be. Some were missing entirely." I felt nauseated, remembering Winston's strange growth in his final weeks. "Why didn't you tell me this before? Would you have believed me?" She looked up, her eyes hollow. I barely believed it myself. Before leaving, I asked if she'd experienced anything unusual since Winston's death. Strange animals, unexplained noises, the feeling of being watched. "No," she said too quickly, avoiding my gaze. "Nothing like that." But as I was walking to my car, she called after me. "Check the backyard before you go, where I buried him." Winston's grave was marked by a small stone my mother had painted with his name. The earth around it had been disturbed, not by an animal digging, but as if something had pushed its way up from below. The hole was perfectly circular, the dirt around its edges strangely smooth, as if melted and resolidified. That night, I dreamed of Winston standing upright at the foot of my bed, his body elongated to human proportions, his fur patchy and revealing grayish skin beneath. In the dream, he spoke to me in a voice that sounded like multiple voices layered together. We've always been here, he said, watching, waiting, learning. I woke to find 3 fresh scratch marks on my bedroom ceiling, directly above where I slept. By early March, my investigation had consumed me entirely. I stopped going to work, using accumulated sick days to focus on understanding what was happening. My apartment walls disappeared beneath papers, theories, and connections drawn in increasingly frantic handwriting. I began researching local history, focusing on unusual animal behavior and unexplained phenomena. At the public library, I discovered references to similar incidents dating back decades. Reports of domestic animals growing to abnormal sizes, wild animals displaying impossible behaviors, people encountering strangers who moved all wrong. These accounts appeared sporadically throughout the county's history, clustering in 7-year cycles. The previous cluster had occurred exactly 7 years ago, culminating in the disappearance of 3 hikers in River Point Park, the same location where Jamie and I had encountered the deer. The hikers' bodies were never found, but one of their cameras was recovered, containing a single photograph. A deer standing on its hind legs beside what appeared to be a human figure with its head twisted backward. I tracked down the retired sheriff who had led the search for the missing hikers. At 78, Bernard Wilson lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, his walls covered with hunting trophies and photographs from his law enforcement career. "I don't talk about that case," he said gruffly when I mentioned the hikers. "Nothing good comes from digging up the past." But when I described my experiences, Winston, the deer, the woman at the hotel, his demeanor changed. He invited me inside, closing and locking the door behind us. "You've seen them," he said, his weathered face grave. "The Watchers." According to Wilson, the entities I'd encountered were neither supernatural nor extraterrestrial, but something that had always existed alongside humanity. Ancient organisms with the ability to mimic other life forms. They lived primarily underground, emerging in cycles to observe, study, and occasionally harvest specimens. "They're curious about us," Wilson explained. "Have been for thousands of years. They learn by inhabiting things. Animals first, usually, then sometimes people." "What do they want?" I asked. Wilson's expression darkened. "To understand us from the inside out." He believed Winston had been their first attempt to reach me, a test subject they'd modified and ultimately inhabited. The deer, the woman at the hotel. These were subsequent attempts, each more sophisticated than the last. "Why me?" My voice sounded distant to my own ears. "Wrong question," Wilson replied. "Better to ask, why now? They're building towards something, a larger emergence." Before I left, Wilson pressed a small leather pouch into my hand. "Keep this with you," he instructed. "It won't stop them, but it might slow them down." The pouch contained a mixture of dried herbs and what appeared to be small bones. Its odor was pungent, medicinal. "One last thing," Wilson called as I walked to my car. "If you see someone you know acting strange, family, friends, anyone, run. Don't try to help them. It won't be them anymore." That night, Jamie called, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "I need to see you," he said. "Something's happening to me." I agreed to meet Jamie at his apartment the following evening, March 17th. Against my better judgment, I went alone, Wilson's warning echoing in my mind. I brought the leather pouch, tucked securely in my jacket pocket. Jamie's building was quiet when I arrived, the hallway to his second-floor apartment dimly lit and deserted. I knocked, hearing movement inside but receiving no response. After a minute, I knocked again, louder. "Jamie? It's me." The door opened a few inches, revealing a slice of darkness. Jamie's voice came from within, strained and barely recognizable. "You shouldn't have come." I pushed the door wider, stepping into the apartment. The blinds were drawn, the only illumination coming from a single lamp in the corner. The air smelled wrong, musty and organic, like a greenhouse filled with rotting plants. Jamie stood in the center of the room, his posture rigid and unnatural. He was wearing the same clothes he'd worn during our hike weeks earlier, now stained and disheveled. "What's going on?" I asked, maintaining distance between us. "You said something was happening to you." "I lied," Jamie replied, his voice fluctuating between his familiar tone and something deeper, resonant. "I needed you here." He took a step forward, moving with a fluidity that seemed choreographed rather than natural. His head tilted at an impossible angle, neck elongating slightly. "We've been watching you," he continued, "learning from you, your fears, your connections, your patterns." I backed toward the door, fingers closing around Wilson's pouch. "You're not Jamie." A smile stretched across his face, too wide, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous, too sharp. "Jamie is here," the thing said. "Part of him. We don't discard, we incorporate." Its movements became increasingly erratic as it spoke, joints bending in directions human anatomy shouldn't allow. Jamie's familiar features remained, but something else animated them. Something ancient and patient. "What do you want?" I demanded, struggling to keep my voice steady. "To understand. To prepare." It gestured toward the window. "The cycle is nearly complete. The emergence approaches." In that moment, I realized the entity wasn't just referring to itself, but to something larger. A collective or colony. The incidents I'd experienced weren't isolated events, but components of a coordinated observation. I threw Wilson's pouch at the creature's feet. The dried contents scattered across the floor, releasing a sharp, acrid scent. The thing wearing Jamie's form recoiled, its movements becoming disjointed, spasmodic. "Primitive deterrence," it hissed, voice distorting. "Temporary." I used its momentary disorientation to escape, slamming the apartment door behind me and racing down the hallway. In the parking lot, I glanced back at Jamie's window and saw not one but 3 figures silhouetted against the blinds, identical in height and build, moving in perfect synchronization. Driving home, I passed dozens of pedestrians on the sidewalks. For the first time, I found myself studying their gaits, their postures, wondering how many others had been incorporated. My apartment no longer felt safe. I packed essential items, clothes, my research notes, Wilson's contact information, planning to leave town immediately. As I was loading my car, my phone rang, my mother's number. "Don't come here," she said without preamble, her voice trembling. "There's something in the house, something wearing Dad's face." My father had died 3 years earlier. "Where are you?" I asked, already sliding into the driver's seat. "Bathroom, door locked, but it knows I'm here. Keeps calling my name in his voice." "I'm coming," I said. "Stay on the phone." "No!" Her panic was palpable. "It's too late. They're everywhere now. The cycle is..." The line went dead. I drove recklessly toward my mother's house, running red lights, weaving through traffic. The sky darkened prematurely, heavy clouds gathering despite no forecast for rain. Other drivers seemed oblivious to my urgency, many traveling well below the speed limit, their faces blank and forward-facing as I passed. At one intersection, I noticed something disturbing. Every pedestrian waiting to cross was standing in identical posture, arms hanging at their sides, heads tilted at the same slight angle. As my car approached, they turned in unison to watch me pass. My mother's neighborhood appeared normal at first glance. Houses quiet, lawns maintained, a few children's bicycles abandoned on sidewalks. But as I parked across the street from her house, I noticed the stillness. No birds called. No insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to have died. The front door of my mother's house stood open. the interior darkness spilling onto the porch like a physical substance. I approached cautiously, Wilson's warnings competing with filial duty in my mind. "Mom?" I called from the threshold, unwilling to enter blindly. No response came from within, but from behind me a chorus of voices answered, all identical, all speaking in perfect unison. "She's with us now." I turned to find the street had filled with people. Neighbors, mail carriers, children, all standing motionless, all staring at me with the same flat expression. Among them stood Jamie, my mother, and a perfect duplicate of myself, indistinguishable except for the unnatural stillness of its posture. "The cycle completes tonight," my doppelganger announced, its voice a disturbing approximation of my own. "The emergence begins." The crowd began moving toward me with that now familiar gliding motion, their feet barely seeming to touch the ground. I retreated into my mother's house, slamming the door and engaging every lock. Through the windows, I could see them assembling on the lawn, forming concentric circles, their movements becoming increasingly synchronized. I searched the house, calling for my mother despite knowing she had likely been incorporated, like Jamie. The house was empty, but evidence of struggle remained. Overturned furniture, a broken lamp, scratches on the walls in sets of 3. In my father's former study, I found a sheet of paper on the desk, covered in my mother's handwriting. "They emerged 7 years ago but weren't ready. Too few hosts, too little understanding. They've been planning, learning, adapting. Tonight they reach critical mass. God help us all." Below these words was a crude map of the county with one location circled repeatedly: River Point Park. Specifically, a section deep within the forest where limestone caves penetrated into the earth. Outside, the crowd had grown larger, encompassing what appeared to be the entire neighborhood. Their concentric circles now rotated in opposite directions, creating a disorienting visual effect. At the center stood my doppelganger, head tilted backward at an impossible angle, mouth open in a silent scream. I realized then that my mother's house wasn't their target. I was. They had herded me here, isolated me. The incorporation they sought required proximity, physical contact. As long as I remained inside, I was temporarily safe. But the map suggested something larger was unfolding at River Point Park. Whatever emergence they planned culminated there, at the caves. If I wanted answers, if there was any hope of stopping this, I needed to reach that location. The house had a rear exit through the kitchen, leading to an alley behind the property. If I could reach my car undetected, I might escape the congregation outside. As darkness fell completely, I prepared to make my attempt, gathering improvised weapons: a kitchen knife, a heavy flashlight, a can of wasp spray that might disorient them temporarily. At precisely 9:17 p.m., a sound like thunder rolled across the sky, though no lightning followed. The crowd outside went completely still, then raised their faces toward the heavens in perfect unison. In that moment of distraction, I slipped out the back door and ran. River Point Park was deserted when I arrived, the entrance gate hanging open despite the late hour. No ranger manned the security booth. No other vehicles occupied the parking area. The forest beyond the trailhead was absolute darkness, the moon and stars obscured by unnatural cloud cover. I retrieved a flashlight from my glove compartment and began walking the main trail, the same path Jamie and I had taken weeks earlier when we encountered the deer. The familiar landscape had transformed in darkness, benign landmarks becoming ominous silhouettes against the night sky. As I ventured deeper into the forest, I became aware of movement among the trees. Not the expected rustling of nocturnal animals, but deliberate, coordinated motion. Figures paced alongside the trail, maintaining distance but matching my speed precisely. My flashlight beam occasionally caught reflective eyes watching from the underbrush. The trail eventually forked, one path continuing toward the river, the other leading toward the limestone formations that house the caves. I took the latter, the ground gradually rising as I approached the rocky outcroppings that dominated this section of the park. The cave entrance was larger than I remembered from childhood visits, a yawning mouth in the hillside, exhaling cool, damp air that carried an organic, almost meaty smell. Unlike the absolute darkness of the forest, a faint phosphorescence emanated from within the cave, casting sickly green light onto the surrounding rocks. I hesitated at the threshold, every instinct warning against entering. But answers lay within, about Winston, about Jamie and my mother, about the nature of the entities that had infiltrated our community. Drawing a deep breath, I stepped inside. The main passage descended gradually, the walls transitioning from rough-hewn rock to something smoother, almost polished. The phosphorescent light grew stronger as I progressed, emanating not from artificial sources but from the stone itself, pulsing with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. After approximately 200 yards, the passage opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness despite the eerie glow. The floor had been cleared of debris and smoothed to create a perfect circle, at the center of which stood a structure that defied description, part organic, part mineral, resembling both a massive fungal growth and a crystalline formation. Surrounding this central structure were hundreds of figures, human in basic shape but moving with that now familiar wrongness. They stood in concentric circles, rotating slowly, their movements creating complex patterns across the chamber floor. Among them, I recognized faces. Jamie, my mother, neighbors, even the desk clerk from the Pineview Hotel. At the base of the central structure knelt my doppelganger, head bowed as if in prayer or submission. As I watched from the passage entrance, it raised its face toward the apex of the formation and began to speak. Not in English or any human language, but in a series of clicks, croaks, and undulating tones reminiscent of Winston's final vocalizations. The formation responded, sections of its surface rippling and changing color. The gathered figures began moving faster, their circles tightening around the central structure. From within the formation came a deep, resonant pulse that I felt rather than heard, vibrating through the stone beneath my feet. I remained frozen, overwhelmed by the scale of what I was witnessing. This wasn't just an infiltration, it was a convergence, perhaps even a birth. The Watchers Wilson had described were assembling for something unprecedented in their cycle. As if sensing my presence, my doppelganger turned, its face splitting into a grotesque approximation of a smile. "You're here," it said, its voice echoing unnaturally in the chamber. The final observer, the last perspective we needed. The rotating circles parted, creating a direct path between me and the central structure. My doppelganger gestured invitingly. "Join us," it continued. "Complete the cycle. Witness the emergence." "What emergence?" I demanded, remaining at the passage entrance. "What are you?" "We are the first inhabitants," my double replied. "Before your kind walked upright, we watched from below. We studied. We waited. Every 7 years, we emerged to observe your progress, to incorporate your innovations into our collective." It approached slowly, its movements becoming more human-like, more convincingly identical to my own. "This cycle is different," it explained. "You've reached a threshold. Technology, consciousness, potential. We no longer merely observe. Now we join." The central structure pulsed more intensely, sections of its surface becoming transparent to reveal a churning mass within. Something vast and incomprehensibly complex, neither fully solid nor liquid. "Your mother understood," my doppelganger continued. "So did your friend. They contributed willingly once they saw the truth. You're the final component, the resistant perspective, the skeptic. We need your understanding to complete our model." It extended a hand that appeared perfectly human. "It doesn't hurt," it assured me. "Incorporation preserves what matters: memories, connections, experiences. Only the vessel changes. For a moment, I almost believed it. The promise of answers, of resolution, of reunion with those I'd lost to this process. But then I recalled Winston's eyes in his final days, the fundamental wrongness I'd sensed from the beginning. "No," I said firmly, backing toward the passage. "Whatever you're becoming, whatever emergence you're planning, it's not mine to join." My double's expression hardened, its features shifting subtly into something less human. "You misunderstand," it said, voice deepening. "Incorporation isn't optional. The cycle must complete." The rotating circles of figures began closing in, their movements accelerating. From the central structure came a sound like tearing fabric, massive and reverberating throughout the chamber. The thing within was emerging, with or without my participation. I turned and ran, retracing my steps through the passage, pursued by the sound of hundreds of feet moving in perfect unison. Behind me, the phosphorescent light intensified, casting my shadow long and distorted before me. Emerging from the cave, I found the forest transformed. Every tree, every bush, every blade of grass stood perfectly still despite a rising wind. The clouds above had formed a spiral directly over the cave entrance, rotating in the same pattern as the figures within the chamber. I reached my car as the ground began to tremble. Starting the engine, I caught a final glimpse of the cave entrance in my rearview mirror. A bloom of that sickly green light erupting outward, engulfing the surrounding forest. Within that light moved shapes too vast, too fundamentally wrong to comprehend. As I drove away from Riverpoint Park, away from the town where I'd spent my entire life, I understood that what I'd witnessed wasn't just a local phenomenon. The Watchers had been present globally, emerging in 7-year cycles throughout human history. What happened tonight would spread, had perhaps already spread, far beyond our small community. I drive now with no destination in mind, only distance. The radio broadcasts continue normally. The few gas stations I've stopped at operate as they always have. But I notice details: the cashier's slightly too precise movements, the identical postures of patrons at roadside diners, the way certain people track my movements with too intense focus. The incorporation continues, spreading outward from that cave like ripples in a pond. I don't know if resistance is possible or if the process can be reversed. I only know that I remain unincorporated, an observer to whatever this new phase represents. Sometimes, in unguarded moments, I find myself standing perfectly still, arms hanging at my sides, head tilted at a slight angle, mimicking their posture unconsciously. In motel bathrooms, I study my reflection carefully, searching for signs of change, of wrongness. So far, I remain myself. But the scratches have followed me, 3 parallel marks appearing on motel doors, on my car's hood, on walls where I've slept. They're watching still, waiting for the moment my vigilance falters. The cycle has completed. The emergence has begun. And I, the final unincorporated observer, record these events as testament to what came before and warning of what follows. God help us all. The radio crackled to life, static buzzing through the small cabin before the dispatcher's voice cut through. "Base to Outpost 17, we've got reports of hikers missing near Black Ridge Trail. 3 individuals, last contact approximately 6 hours ago. Over." I pulled myself from the edge of sleep, fumbling for the handset. Another search and rescue operation in the making. After 15 years as a park ranger in Cascade National Forest, these calls still sent the same rush of adrenaline through my veins. "Outpost 17 to base. Copy that. I'll head out immediately. Coordinates?" The dispatcher rattled off the location, deep in the northwestern sector, dangerously close to what we rangers privately called the dead zone. Not because of cell reception, though that was certainly non-existent out there. No, the nickname stemmed from something else entirely. the unusually high number of disappearances that occurred within its boundaries. Hikers who vanished without a trace, experienced outdoorsmen who seemed to evaporate into the thick forest canopy. As I gathered my gear, I caught a glimpse of my weathered face in the small mirror above my sink. The lines around my eyes had deepened over the years, carved there by harsh winters and scorching summers alike. The forest had marked me as surely as I had marked my trails through it. Outside, darkness was setting in. Most search operations wouldn't start until dawn, but these hikers were in the dead zone. If I waited until morning, experience told me we'd find nothing but abandoned gear, if that. I shouldered my pack and checked my rifle. Not standard issue for park rangers, but those of us stationed at the remote outposts were granted certain exceptions. The wilderness didn't play by human rules, and neither did its dangers. As I stepped out into the cool night air, the trees seemed to whisper around me. Most people think forests are silent at night. They're wrong. The darkness amplifies every sound, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig. 15 years in these woods, and I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was always watching. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the darkness as I made my way toward my truck. The beam caught something at the edge of the clearing, a reflection perhaps, or a trick of the light. I swung the beam back, but there was nothing there. Just shadows playing among the pines. I climbed into my truck and headed out, the narrow service road winding deeper into the heart of the forest. The radio occasionally sputtered with updates, but mostly it was just me and the rumble of the engine, and the memories. 5 years ago, I'd found a book in the cabin when I was first stationed there. The Whispering Forest by Theodore Blackwood. A horror novel about a forest ranger who encounters something ancient and terrible in the woods. I'd laughed it off then, filed it under campy horror in my mind, and shelved it beside the field guides and wilderness survival manuals. But after what I'd seen in these woods, I wasn't laughing anymore. The truck's headlights caught something on the road ahead, a dark shape that moved with uncanny speed across the path before disappearing into the underbrush. Too large for a coyote, too fast for a bear. I slowed the truck, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Just your imagination, I muttered to myself, accelerating again. Focus on the hikers. But as I drove deeper into the forest, toward the dead zone and whatever awaited me there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being herded, like prey. The missing hikers would need to be found quickly. Night temperatures were dropping, and hypothermia was a real danger. That is, if hypothermia was the only danger they faced out here in the darkness. I turned onto the barely visible trailhead that would take me toward their last known location, the truck bouncing over exposed roots and rocks. Whatever was out there in the shadows, I was heading straight for it. Dawn broke over the forest with reluctant fingers of light that barely penetrated the dense canopy. I'd made camp at the edge of the Black Ridge Trail after the terrain became too rough for the truck. Sleep had been fitful at best. The forest has a way of keeping you alert even when exhaustion begs otherwise. I'd been a ranger long enough to know the drill for finding lost hikers, search for signs of disturbance, call out at regular intervals, listen for responses. But in the dead zone, standard procedures often proved useless. People didn't just get lost here, they vanished. "Hello, Park Service," I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. The only response was the startled flutter of wings as a group of ravens took flight. As I hiked deeper into the wilderness, I documented everything with methodical precision. 3 sets of boot prints heading northeast, following the trail before veering off unexpectedly near a large rock formation. A discarded water bottle, still half full. A torn piece of red fabric snagged on a thorny bush. The trail of evidence led me to a small clearing I'd never encountered before, despite my extensive knowledge of this section of forest. In the center stood what appeared to be a crude structure of branches and stones arranged in a pattern that was distinctly unnatural. My radio crackled to life suddenly, making me jump. Repeat, Outpost 17. Do you copy? Over. I grabbed the handset. This is Outpost 17. Go ahead, base. We've got additional information on your missing hikers. Turns out they were heading into the area to investigate local folklore. Something about the Cascade Strider or some such nonsense. Over. The Cascade Strider. My blood ran cold. It was one of many local names for the creature that allegedly haunted these woods. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the Wild Man. Every region had its own version of the myth. Except I wasn't sure it was just a myth anymore. Copy that, base. Any other information I should know? Over. Negative. Just find these idiots before they become statistics. Base out. I clipped the radio back to my belt, surveying the clearing again. The structure in the center resembled something I'd seen once before, in a photograph attached to a report filed by a ranger who'd gone missing 10 years ago. His last documented discovery before he vanished without a trace. The report had been quietly buried by administration. Too fantastical, they said. The ranger must have suffered a psychological break from the isolation, but I'd seen the photos. I'd read his meticulous notes. And now I was standing in front of the same kind of structure. I approached cautiously, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The arrangement was deliberate. Branches woven together in complex patterns, stones placed at specific intervals. Not the work of hikers or campers. Not the random debris of nature. Something pressed beneath my boot as I circled the structure. Looking down, I saw a smartphone in a camouflage case. One of the missing hikers, no doubt. I picked it up, hoping it might contain clues, but the battery was dead. A sound caught my attention. A low, resonant thump that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Like a massive heartbeat pulsing through the earth itself. Thump. I held my breath, listening. Thump. The sound was moving, circling the clearing. I reached slowly for my rifle, scanning the dense wall of trees surrounding me. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, no rustling of leaves despite the gentle breeze I could feel on my face. Thump. 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 The rhythm increased, like something approaching at a run. I raised my rifle, aiming at the tree line where the sound seemed loudest. "Park Service," I shouted. "Identify yourself." The sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the ominous thumping. Then I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees. Massive, upright, moving with a fluid grace that no bear or known predator could manage. Just for a moment, silhouetted against the lighter backdrop of distant foliage. Then it was gone. I stood frozen, rifle still raised, heartbeat thundering in my ears. Part of me, the rational, trained, professional part, tried to categorize what I'd seen. A bear standing on hind legs? An elaborate hoax perpetrated by the missing hikers? But deep down, I knew better. Whatever I'd glimpsed was something science had no name for. Something that had been hunting these woods long before humans claimed them as protected land. And now it was hunting me. I followed the tracks deeper into the forest, each step taking me further from any semblance of safety. The day was waning, shadows lengthening across the forest floor like grasping fingers. In a few hours, darkness would reclaim these woods, and I'd be alone with whatever lurked among the trees. The missing hiker's trail had become increasingly erratic. Signs of running, of panic. Dropped gear suggested they'd fled in terror, abandoning anything that slowed them down. I collected what I could. A high-end DSLR camera, a journal filled with notes about Bigfoot sightings, a digital voice recorder. I played the recorder as I walked, listening to the excited voices of 3 young people embarking on what they called their Sasquatch safari. Their enthusiasm reminded me of a Reddit thread I'd once stumbled across titled, "I'm a park ranger and we're not allowed to talk about the staircases in the woods." The thread had detailed strange phenomena in national parks across the country, phenomena officially denied by park services, but whispered about by rangers around campfires. The recording continued, documenting their journey until the tone suddenly shifted. "Did you hear that?" a female voice whispered. Rustling, then silence. Then, "Jesus Christ, it's huge. Run, Rue." The recording cut off in a burst of static. I stopped the playback, a chill running through me despite the warm afternoon. Looking up, I realized I'd wandered into a part of the forest I didn't recognize. The trees here were older, massive trunks stretching skyward, canopies blocking out most of the sunlight. The undergrowth was sparse, the forest floor covered in a thick carpet of moss that muffled my footsteps. And then I saw them, the structures. Dozens of them, similar to the one I'd found in the clearing, but larger, more complex. They formed a rough circle around a central space where the moss had been cleared away, revealing bare earth. This was no random arrangement. This was deliberate, territorial, a warning. I should have turned back, called for backup. But the thought of the missing hikers pushed me forward. If they'd stumbled across this place, they would have been trespassing on something ancient and territorial, something that might still have them. In the center of the clearing, pressed into the bare earth, was a massive footprint, at least 18 inches long, with 5 distinct toe impressions. Too large for any known primate, too detailed to be fake. I photographed it methodically, placing my own boot beside it for scale. My size 12 hiking boot looked childlike in comparison. As I knelt there, studying the print, a realization slowly dawned on me. The forest had gone silent again. No birds, no insects, nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the blood rushing in my ears. I rose slowly, scanning the tree line, and that's when I saw them. The hikers, or what was left of them. 3 backpacks neatly arranged at the base of the largest tree at the edge of the clearing. Beneath them, 3 pairs of hiking boots, each containing the severed feet of their owners. My stomach lurched. In 15 years as a ranger, I'd seen my share of tragedies. Hikers who'd fallen to their deaths, campers mauled by bears, climbers frozen on mountainsides. But this was different. This was deliberate, ritualistic. I keyed my radio, hand trembling. Outpost 17 to base. I found evidence of the missing hikers. Sending coordinates. Request immediate backup and medical examiner. Over. Only static answered me. I tried again, switching channels, checking the battery. Nothing. The radio was working, but no signal was getting through. Almost as if something was blocking it. A branch snapped behind me. A sound so ordinary, yet so terrifying in that moment that I nearly dropped the radio. I spun around, rifle raised, to find myself staring at a wall of fur and muscle that hadn't been there seconds before. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its broad shoulders nearly spanning the width of 2 men. The body was covered in thick dark hair, but the face, God, the face. Almost human, but not quite. Eyes that reflected intelligence and ancient rage in equal measure. We stared at each other, predator and prey, though in that moment I wasn't sure which was which. It could have killed me instantly. Instead, it studied me with an intensity that felt like it was looking straight through to my soul. Then it spoke, not in words, but in a series of deep, guttural vocalizations that resonated through my chest. I'd heard recordings of supposed Bigfoot calls before, but this was different. This had structure, cadence, intent. It was communicating. And somehow, on some primal level, I couldn't explain, I understood. It was telling me to leave, to take the evidence of the hiker's fate as a warning and never return to this place. I backed away slowly, rifle still raised, but knowing it would be useless against this creature. With each step I took toward the edge of the clearing, it remained motionless, watching. Only when I reached the tree line did it move, sinking into a crouch that somehow made it seem even more threatening. I turned and ran, the sound of my panicked flight echoing through the silent forest. Behind me came that rhythmic thumping again. Thump, 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 keeping pace but never closing the distance, herding me out of its territory. As I crashed through the undergrowth, blind with terror, one thought kept repeating in my mind. I wasn't the hunter here. I never had been. When I finally made it back to my truck, darkness had fully enveloped the forest. I sat behind the wheel, hands shaking too badly to insert the key into the ignition. The radio bursting to life nearly sent me through the roof. Base to Outpost 17, please respond. We've lost contact for over 4 hours. Do you copy? Over. I grabbed the handset. This is Outpost 17, I said, my voice hoarse. I'm heading back to base. The hikers are dead. Over. Say again, Outpost 17, you found the hikers? Over. Affirmative, they're dead. I'll report in person. Over and out. I couldn't bring myself to describe what I'd seen over the radio. They wouldn't believe me anyway, just like they hadn't believed the ranger who disappeared 10 years ago. The drive back to my cabin was a blur. Every shadow in the headlights seemed to move. Every dark patch between the trees concealed watching eyes. By the time I pulled up to my outpost, exhaustion had overtaken fear, leaving me numb. I should have reported immediately to headquarters, but I needed time. Time to process what I'd seen. Time to decide what to tell them. Inside my cabin, I emptied my pockets of the evidence I'd collected. The smartphone, the voice recorder, my own photographs of the footprint, the strange structures. I played the voice recorder again, listening for any sounds in the background that might corroborate what I'd seen. Then I noticed the camera, the high-end DSLR I'd recovered from the hikers' abandoned gear. With trembling fingers, I turned it on and navigated to the photo gallery. The first dozen photos were what you'd expect. Scenic forest shots, the 3 hikers posing at trailheads, close-ups of interesting fungi or plants. Then came the clearing with the structures. The hikers had found it too, documented it from every angle. And then, in the final series of photos, I found it. A blur of movement captured at the edge of the frame. I enlarged the image, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't clear, a smudge of dark against the greens and browns of the forest. But the outline was unmistakable. A massive, upright figure moving between the trees. I sat back in my chair, staring at the photo. Proof. Not conclusive, not clear enough to convince the skeptics, but proof, nonetheless. My gaze drifted to the bookshelf where Theodore Blackwood's novel sat gathering dust. I pulled it down, flipping through the yellowed pages until I found the passage I remembered. The indigenous peoples called it the guardian of the deep woods, a being neither man nor beast, but something ancient that had watched our species climb down from the trees and learn to use tools. It tolerated our presence until we began to destroy its home, cut down its forests, pollute its streams. Then it fought back, not with our weapons of steel and gunpowder, but with fear. It became the shadow in the corner of your eye, the reason your ancestors feared the dark. It became legend, myth, folklore, hiding in plain sight as a story too absurd for modern minds to believe. A chill ran through me as I read those words. Blackwood hadn't been writing fiction. He'd been documenting truth in the only form people would accept it. Something moved outside my window, a shadow passing across the glass too quickly to identify. I froze, listening to the night sounds of the forest. Was that rhythmic thumping just my imagination, or was it drawing closer to my cabin? The radio crackled again. Base to Outpost 17. Search and recovery team is assembled and ready to move at first light. Please confirm coordinates for the hiker's location. Over. I stared at the handset, knowing what I had to do. I couldn't send them in there unprepared, not knowing what waited in those woods. Outpost 17 to base. Be advised, the situation is... I paused, searching for words that wouldn't make me sound insane. The situation is more complex than initially reported. Request permission to brief the team in person before deployment. Over. Copy that. Outpost 17. Permission granted. Report to headquarters at 600. Base out. I set the radio down and returned to the window, peering out into the darkness. The forest seemed to press against the glass, the thin walls of my cabin suddenly feeling like inadequate protection. What would I tell them? How could I make them understand what was out there without sounding like I'd lost my mind? And if they did believe me, what then? A hunting party sent to kill something that had likely lived in these woods for centuries. The thought made me sick. Whatever the creature was, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the guardian of the deep woods, it wasn't the mindless beast of campfire stories. It had intelligence, language, purpose. It had killed the hikers, yes, but they had trespassed into its domain, armed with cameras and recorders, intent on exposing its existence to the world. Wasn't that what I was planning to do now? Outside, a branch snapped. Close, too close to be coincidence. It was here, watching my cabin, watching me. I made my decision then. Gathering the evidence, the photos, the recorder, the camera, I placed it all in a metal trash can outside the cabin's back door. With shaking hands, I struck a match and dropped it in, watching as the flames consumed the only proof of what I'd witnessed. When nothing remained but ashes, I whispered into the darkness, "I understand. Your secret is safe." From the edge of the forest came a soft, acknowledging grunt. Then silence. Morning arrived with a heavy mist that clung to the trees, transforming the forest into a ghostly landscape of shifting shadows. I hadn't slept, spending the night alternating between watching the tree line and questioning my own sanity. Had I really destroyed evidence in some misguided attempt to protect a creature that had killed 3 people? Or was I protecting something else? Something older and more important than any single human life? I rehearsed my story as I drove to headquarters. The hikers had ventured off trail, likely fallen victims to exposure and wildlife. I'd found signs of bear activity near their abandoned gear. No, I hadn't found bodies, just evidence suggesting they couldn't have survived. It was the kind of report that would be accepted without too many questions. Missing hikers in national parks weren't uncommon, and Cascade had its share of tragedies. The case would remain open but inactive, filed away with the others that had no resolution. But as I pulled into the headquarters parking lot, something stopped me. The memory of those structures in the clearing, the intelligent eyes of the creature, the ritualistic arrangement of the hikers' remains. This wasn't just another wilderness accident. This was communication, a warning that needed to be heeded. Inside, the search and recovery team was already assembled. 6 rangers, 2 with tracking dogs, all equipped for a multi-day operation. Chief Ranger Martinez nodded as I entered, her expression grim. "Bishop," she acknowledged. "I understand you have information about our missing hikers." All eyes turned to me. This was the moment. Lie and send these people into danger, or tell the truth and face the consequences. "They're dead," I said flatly. "And we need to close Black Ridge Trail. Permanently." Martinez's eyebrows shot up. "That's a serious request, Bishop. I'm going to need more than your word." "I know what killed them," I continued, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. "The same thing that's responsible for every disappearance in the dead zone for the past 50 years. The room went silent. Some of the younger rangers exchanged skeptical glances, but the veterans, those who had worked these woods as long as I had, their expressions remained carefully neutral. "You're talking about the Cascade Strider," Martinez said, not a question but a statement. "I'm talking about something that lives in these woods and considers a portion of them its territory," I replied. "Something intelligent enough to communicate warnings and enforce boundaries." "You've seen it?" one of the younger rangers asked, disbelief evident in his tone. I met his gaze steadily. "Yes." Martinez dismissed the search team, asking them to wait outside. When the door closed behind them, she turned to me. "Sit down, Bishop. Tell me everything. And I mean everything." So I did. The structures, the footprint, the creature itself. The way it had herded me out of its territory rather than killing me outright. The evidence I'd found and subsequently destroyed. When I finished, Martinez was silent for a long moment, studying me with unreadable eyes. "You know how this sounds," she finally said. "I do." "And you destroyed the only evidence that might have supported your story." "I did." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Why? Why protect something that killed 3 people?" "Because they trespassed," I said simply. "They went looking for it, deliberately invaded its space, tried to expose its existence. It was defending its home. That's not how the families of those hikers will see it." "No," I agreed. "It's not." Martinez stood and paced to the window, looking out at the forest that stretched to the horizon. "You know there's a file," she said quietly. "Incidents dating back to the 1970s, rangers who reported similar encounters. Most transferred out afterward. Some quit. A few disappeared." My breath caught. "You've known all along?" She turned back to me. "I've suspected. There's a difference." She paused. "The thing is, Bishop, every year we get millions of visitors to this forest. Families, researchers, adventurers. Are you suggesting we close off entire sections because something might be living there that doesn't want to be disturbed?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "That's exactly what I'm suggesting." "Based on what? A story about a monster in the woods?" "I need more than that, Bishop. I need something I can take to the Department of the Interior." I had nothing to offer her. No photos, no recordings, nothing but my word. And yet I knew what I'd seen. What those hikers had found. What had happened to them could happen again. The indigenous peoples who lived here long before this became a national park had stories, I said slowly. Stories about territories that belonged to the spirit of the forest. Places humans were forbidden to enter. They respected those boundaries for generations. "And you think we should do the same based on legends?" "I think those legends existed for a reason," I countered. "I think they were warnings, passed down through generations to keep people safe. And I think we've forgotten how to listen." Martinez was quiet for a long time. Finally, she nodded. "I'll recommend seasonal closures for the Black Ridge Trail and surrounding areas. Wildlife management study. It's the best I can do without evidence." It wasn't enough, but it was something. "Thank you." As I left headquarters, the search team was still waiting, looking at me expectantly. Martinez would give them a sanitized version of events I knew. A story of hikers who had ventured where they shouldn't have, met with tragedy, with no bodies to recover. Some would believe it. Others would whisper around campfires about the Cascade Strider, adding to the mythology. A few might even venture into the dead zone, seeking the truth for themselves. And some of them wouldn't return. 5 years have passed since my encounter in the woods. I still serve as a ranger at Outpost 17, though I rarely venture near the dead zone these days. True to her word, Chief Martinez implemented seasonal closures for Black Ridge Trail, citing ecological studies and wildlife management. The families of the missing hikers eventually received closure of a sort, a formal declaration of death, though without bodies to bury. Their disappearance became another statistic, another tale of wilderness claiming those who underestimated its dangers. But I know the truth. Sometimes, on still nights when the forest seems to hold its breath, I hear that rhythmic thumping in the distance. Thump, thump, thump. Like a heartbeat pulsing through the trees. A reminder that I am not alone in these woods. That I never have been. I've come to understand something in these 5 years. The creature, the Sasquatch, the Bigfoot, whatever name humans have given it throughout the centuries, isn't the intruder here. We are. Its kind has lived in these forests for thousands, perhaps millions of years before the first human ever set foot in North America. They've watched us cut down ancient trees, dam rivers, build roads through pristine wilderness. They've retreated further and further into the diminishing wild places, establishing territories that grow smaller with each passing decade. Is it any wonder they defend what little remains? Not long after my encounter, I found a package on my doorstep. No postmark, no return address. Inside was a manuscript titled Guardians of the Ancient Forest: Truth Behind the Myth. The author's name was listed simply as a former ranger. The manuscript detailed encounters spanning decades across national parks throughout North America. The descriptions matched my experience with uncanny precision. The structures, the territorial behavior, the intelligence behind those searching eyes. According to the manuscript, there aren't many of them left. Perhaps a few hundred scattered across the most remote wilderness areas of the continent. They avoid humans when possible, defend their territories when necessary, and only attack when provoked or threatened. They are, in essence, the last guardians of truly wild places. I keep the manuscript locked in my desk drawer, alongside Theodore Blackwood's novel and a small leather pouch I found hanging from a branch outside my cabin one morning. Inside the pouch was a single massive tooth, unmistakably primate, but larger than any known species. A gift? A warning? I'm still not sure. What I am sure of is that the forest holds secrets modern humans have forgotten how to hear. Our ancestors knew better. They created stories and legends to encode warnings about places we shouldn't go, beings we shouldn't disturb. They understood something we've lost in our rush to catalog, classify, and control the natural world. Some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries. Last month, a new ranger was assigned to the outpost nearest Black Ridge Trail. Young, eager, full of modern wildlife management theories and technological solutions. He asked me about the seasonal closures, about the dead zone, about the stories he'd heard from other rangers. I told him what I tell all newcomers: respect the boundaries. Some parts of the forest aren't meant for humans. Some territories belong to creatures older and wiser than us. Most laugh it off as the superstitions of an old ranger who spent too many years alone in the woods. Some listen politely but dismiss the warning once out of earshot. A few, the ones who've spent enough time in true wilderness to sense the ancient rhythms that still pulse beneath the surface of our modern world, they understand. They're the ones who might survive a career in these woods. Tonight, as I sit on the porch of my cabin watching darkness claim the forest, I can feel eyes watching from the tree line. Not hostile, not threatening, simply aware. Watching and waiting as they have for centuries. I raise my coffee mug in a silent toast to the shadows among the pines. An acknowledgement between two species sharing this small corner of the world. One ancient and dwindling, one young and expanding, both bound by the same primeval forest. In the distance, that familiar sound. Thump, 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 good hunting, I whisper to the darkness. And somewhere in the forest, something answers. My husband and I moved into our camper van back in October, and our first stop was to visit family in West Texas, then move on to Arizona for a music festival. After the festival ended, we decided to hang around Tucson for a bit and see the gym and mineral show before heading north to Flagstaff, then to the Grand Canyon. While heading to the Grand Canyon, we found an awesome boondocking spot in the Coconino National Forest. It was on this small Forest Service road that only had 2 spots on it, and one was occupied by a man and his young son, who I assumed were spending the day in Sedona, about 45 minutes away, and retiring early to their RV. We snagged the last spot before crossing, which was awesome. It was perched up on this hill that had been leveled at the top. You could see all the mountain ranges surrounding you with the ranch fence next to us. The ranch was over the next mountain in the valley. There were wild cattle around, and the landscape was absolutely breathtaking. I spent most of my day just staring out at it. It's an extremely remote place as well, which we love, because we love stargazing and privacy. We go to bed early most evenings around sunset, waking up around sunrise with a middle-of-the-night bathroom break. We woke up and walked outside for our bathroom break and could not believe the stars. They looked wonderful. We went back to bed and agreed to stay another night just to see the stars again even better. The following day we spent listening to music and rock hounding and taking in the landscape. I kept looking at this one particular ridge, telling my husband that a bright light was shining on it, almost like a strobe. He looked, and it was gone. It wasn't something I thought of until I saw it a few times again. And then I became concerned. As a wilderness first responder, maybe there was a hiker out there who was stranded on the ridge trying to get our attention. But the areas that the light came from changed much too often for someone to be traveling by foot or bike. Later that evening, after we made dinner, we sat outside watching the sunset and decided to go back in the van to hang out while it got dark out. Then it would be dark enough to really see all the stars in the Milky Way. It was around 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. We came out and I immediately looked up. There was this light that was so bright white, and it seemed close. I asked if that was the North Star, and if so, how could it be so bright and close to us? My husband said he wasn't sure. We kept walking around our site, looking at the sky and the satellites. We went around the van, then back to our original spot and looked up. Immediately, we noticed the light was gone. But then we began to notice the light again. It was moving further away. It was a different color now, too. It was moving rapidly. It would jump around almost like a hummingbird, but changing color between yellow, red, and blue. I've seen a lot of different phenomena in my life, so I wasn't particularly worried or shocked, especially since we had just seen the Martha lights, which looked similar, but with more flowing movements. That all changed in the next few moments. And the light began to change colors into monochromatic ranges of deep violet and violet blues with magenta. It was almost peaceful looking, soothing. It started moving closer to us, changing colors more often. Blues, violets, pinks, greens. It came down to the ground level on the other side of the large juniper. I lost my breath at that point. The juniper was only a short distance from us, and at this point we noticed that it was literally peeking at us from around the juniper, just as we had been peeking at it from around our van. It moved so much like, I guess the way to describe it, it was like a curious child, and it seemed like the light would have been where the face was, and as tall as an average male. All of a sudden I realized how close we were to seeing it, and I became afraid, because I don't think I was ready to see it. It's like a big question that's about to be revealed. And are you sure you want to know the answer? You can't go back. The box would be open. I may have made a noise or jumped back when the fear set in. And this light thing did not like this. It got very low to the ground, almost cat-like, and was looking through the bushes. Immediately it began to pulsate red, the color of aggression. It scared the heck out of me, to be honest. We ran back to the van, jumping in and locking the doors. Our van has this bubble-wrap mylar insulation in the windows, which we put up in the winter months to keep in the warmth so we couldn't see out of them. At that point, I didn't want to. I was horrifying. I couldn't catch my breath. After we finally calmed down, we decided we needed to look. What person wouldn't? We got out to inspect. Where the light had been before now seemed empty. This was a relief, but it also made me wonder if I was making the whole thing up. Then I looked to my left, just beyond the fence to the ranch. I noticed several of the same type of lights moving back and forth in greens and blues. They were pretty far away, so I wasn't so worried, and I felt a bit more calm about the situation. They were far away enough. For some reason, I turned towards the ridge I'd been looking at earlier that morning. I thought I saw something larger. I told myself that I was just crazy to disregard it. And at that moment, a bright light came on. But it wasn't a light. It was a creature of some sort. Very similar to something you would imagine from movies that depict alien beings as robots, or were robotic machines. This machine was large and clearly visible. It was shining a light into the valley where we had just seen the blue and green lights. It flashed a couple of times, and then was gone. All the other lights were gone shortly after that and did not come back that night. I wish we had thought to grab our phones, but the first one happened so rapidly that it didn't at all occur to us to record it, though there was quite a bit of strangeness in the photos I had taken during trip. Around 2012, my best friend and I were hiking through the woods of one of the local mountains late in the afternoon for some exercise and because we were bored as can be. Not much happened on the way up. A few kangaroos here and there, but not much else. Great view at the top. Good chill spot too. So after the sun went down, we got the flashlights and headlamps out, carefully making our way down the mountain towards town. Again, not a lot happened along the way back, aside from some odd noises. About 3/4 of the way down, we stopped for a bit to rest, which in itself was odd, as we weren't all that tired out heading up the mountain, and we'd had plenty of rest at the summit. We both felt pretty drained though, but since our backpacks were lighter after consuming some of the supplies, it seemed a bit out of the ordinary. Then we noticed it. A dead silence up there. No nightlife, no nothing, no crickets, and even the roofs weren't crashing about the area like they had been. Absolutely nothing. So we were understandably a bit weirded out, and decided we should quietly pick up the pace. As we made it to the bottom, it was like the sound had been turned back on or something. So we continued on our way, feeling normal again, having a yak about random crap and moving aside for the rare car. About another kilometer or two later, we started hearing some weird stuff, and we'd noticed that all the other sounds had once again stopped. This time, when I started to feel tired, my adrenaline started pumping instead, because I remembered it had happened before. And then that sound happened again, some kind of rasping, throaty roar in the distance. It came from ahead and to the right of the road in the woods. Danged if I know what it was, but I do know that that sound isn't achievable by a human. As we got closer, we could hear a lot of crashing noises in the area we'd originally heard the sound from, followed by that horrible sound again, and the sound of an animal in agony being cut short. From when we first heard it, up until that point, we had turned off our lights and were practically creeping along the road. But now curiosity unfortunately got the better of us. We shone our torches over in the area. Those messed up sounds had been coming from Saw Next, nearly made me wimp out to the max. And if my best friend hadn't been there, I would have bolted back to town. However, despite our attempts to show the whole macho as always vibe, all we could do was ready our knives and stare uncomprehendingly at this thing that was staring right the heck back at us. To make matters pants-rackingly worse, this gosh-danged thing had a dead, almost full-grown kangaroo in its mouth, or what was left of the roo anyway, since it seems like it was gutted alive and was still kind of twitching. Every instinct told me to run like a bat out of hell back to town, but thankfully reason trumped my instincts, and I chose not to make any sudden moves, especially since I somehow knew that we wouldn't make it very far if either of us ran. For what felt like ages, it seemed to be watching us, as though deciding whether to drop its fresh kill in exchange for us. Then it sort of hunched up and made a slightly muffled form of that sound it seemed to make, backing up a little and jumping over 5 meters up the darned cliff face behind it. It then made the noise again, before jumping and climbing further up the cliff and out of sight. Big, with gray-white hair or fur, and it could stand on 2 legs when it needed to. It had freaky shaped but clearly powerful jaws and claws like darned hens. But worst of all were its eyes. I swear, those eyes, they looked like they were full of nothing more than hunger and hatred. Needless to say, I don't like going hiking at night anymore.